James Rivera's morning started normally, which in retrospect should have been his first warning that something terrible was about to happen. He'd made coffee in the small kitchenette of his embassy quarters, reviewed the day's schedule, 2 trade negotiation sessions, 1 cultural briefing, lunch with a mid-level supply coordinator, and tried to convince himself that 8 months on Velshara Prime meant he was finally getting the hang of alien diplomacy. This delusion lasted approximately 40 minutes, right up until the Imperial Guard arrived at his door. The guard was tall, even by Velsharan standards, wearing ceremonial armor that looked like it could stop a small missile and possibly redirect it back at the person who fired it. Their bioluminescent markings glowed steady purple against dark skin, and those distinctive long ears, swept back and adorned with military insignia, tracked his every movement with unsettling precision. "James Rivera," the guard said, not asking, just confirming, "your presence is required in the throne hall, immediately, by order of Queen Salthara herself." James's coffee mug paused halfway to his mouth. "I'm sorry, what?" "The Queen has summoned you. We leave now." "Can I at least?" James gestured vaguely at himself, still wearing casual clothes, his hair doing that thing where it stuck up on one side no matter how much he tried to fix it. "Should I change? Notify my ambassador? Maybe get some context about why the actual Queen wants to see me?" The guard's expression suggested these were all reasonable questions that they had absolutely no intention of answering. "We leave now," they repeated. The walk through the palace was surreal in the way that dreams are surreal right before they become nightmares. James had been to the palace before, obviously. It was central to diplomatic operations on Velshara Prime, but always to the outer administrative wings, the sections designed for foreign visitors and trade negotiations. Now the guards were escorting him through corridors he'd only seen in briefing materials, past security checkpoints that scanned him with technology that made his skin prickle and his teeth ache. Other Velsharans stopped to watch as they passed. Nobles in formal robes, their markings indicating lineages that predated human spaceflight. Military officers with enough decorations to suggest they'd personally won several wars. Administrative officials who looked at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed disdain. News was traveling, James realized. By the time he reached the throne hall, half the palace would know a human had been summoned by the Queen, and the other half would be making up increasingly dramatic reasons why. He ran through everything he'd done in the past week, searching for mistakes. Had he violated some protocol he didn't know about? The Velsharans had approximately 8,000 formal customs, and his cultural database only covered maybe 3,000 of them. Had Earth done something stupid that he was about to be held accountable for? Was this about the trade negotiations? He'd thought those were going well, but maybe he'd misread the situation entirely. The throne hall doors opened with a sound like thunder trying to be polite about it, and James's anxiety spiked into territory that probably wasn't healthy for human cardiovascular systems. The hall was massive, designed with the specific architectural goal of making visitors feel insignificant. Crystalline columns rose to a ceiling so high it created its own weather patterns. Bioluminescent vines covered the walls, their light pulsing in patterns that his translator suggested was decorative text in ancient Velsharan, probably saying something profound about honor and glory, and how small you were in comparison. The court was assembled, dozens of nobles, advisors, military officials, all arranged in careful hierarchical positions that communicated status through spatial relationships James only barely understood. And at the center, on a throne that seemed to grow organically from the floor like the galaxy's most intimidating furniture, sat Queen Salthara herself. James had seen images of the Queen, obviously. You couldn't work on Velshara Prime without encountering her face on everything from official documents to what passed for propaganda. But images didn't capture the presence, the way she commanded space just by existing in it. Her golden markings glowed against skin that was darker than most Velsharans, indicating a bloodline that traced back to the original Unification Wars. She wore armor that somehow managed to be both ceremonial and functional, decorated with achievements that represented about 300 years of collective military and political victories. She was studying him the way a scientist might study an interesting microorganism, her expression giving away absolutely nothing. The guards brought James to the appropriate distance from the throne, close enough to hear clearly, far enough to acknowledge the hierarchy, and he went through the formal bowing sequence his cultural training had drilled into him. 45-degree bow, hold for 3 seconds, straighten, hands at sides, eyes forward but not directly meeting the Queen's gaze unless invited. He'd practiced this dozens of times. He still felt like he was probably doing it wrong. "James Rivera of Earth," the Queen said, her voice carrying across the massive hall without apparent effort. "You have served in our empire for 8 months. In that time, you have distinguished yourself as honest, competent, and unexpectedly perceptive for one so young." James tried to figure out if this was leading somewhere good or somewhere very bad. In his experience, compliments from powerful people often preceded very unpleasant revelations. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I've tried to serve both Earth and the Empire to the best of my abilities." "You have also," the Queen continued, and something in her tone made every person in the hall seem to lean forward slightly, "caught the attention of my daughter." The entire court inhaled simultaneously, a collective intake of breath that sounded like the hall itself was surprised. James's brain attempted to process this statement, failed, attempted again, and produced only static and confusion. Daughter, the Queen's daughter. Princess Caelcindra, heir to the Velsharan throne, warrior scholar who commanded respect across the empire, who James had never met because she was always away on campaigns or research expeditions. Someone so far outside his social orbit that he'd never even considered. "I don't understand," James said, which probably wasn't the diplomatic response but was definitely the honest one. The Queen leaned forward slightly, her golden markings brightening with what might have been amusement or might have been something more dangerous. Her eyes locked onto his with the intensity of a targeting system. "Tell me, James Rivera of Earth, are you prepared to be my daughter's husband?" The question hung in the air like a detonation that hadn't exploded yet but definitely would. James felt his mouth open, felt sound try to form, felt his brain attempting to restart from a complete system failure. Around him, the court was absolutely silent, every person watching, waiting for his response. Husband. Marriage, princess. The words connected to concepts, but the concepts refused to make sense. He'd come here expecting a routine meeting, maybe a reprimand, possibly a diplomatic headache. He had not expected a marriage proposal from alien royalty delivered by her mother in front of the entire court. "Your Majesty," he managed, his voice coming out higher than intended. I've never met Princess Caelcindra. I don't understand what you're asking." "You have met her," the Queen said, and there was definitely amusement in her tone now. "Several times, in fact, though perhaps not in the capacity you assumed." Movement in the shadows at the edge of the hall caught his attention. A figure stepped forward into the light, and James's heart stopped for entirely new reasons. He recognized her. The library researcher who'd spent 2 weeks helping him understand Velsharan mourning customs, who'd been patient and knowledgeable, and had actually seemed interested in his questions, rather than just tolerating them. Tall, athletic build, silver markings he'd thought indicated scholarly caste, intense green eyes that had seemed to look right through him in a way that was unsettling and compelling in equal measure. She was wearing formal armor now, royal insignia marking her as heir to the throne, and she was looking at him with an expression that mixed hope and nervousness, and something else he couldn't quite identify. "Hello, James," she said, and her voice was exactly the same as the researcher's, exactly the same as his brain made connections it should have made before. The supply coordinator who'd resolved that dispute about embassy provisions 3 months ago. The off-duty guard he'd shared drinks with at the tavern near the embassy 2 months ago, the one he'd defended when a drunk noble had insulted her. All the same person, all the princess, watching him, evaluating him without him knowing. "You were testing me," James said, pieces clicking into place. "I was observing you," Princess Kaelsindra corrected, moving to stand beside her mother's throne. "There's a difference." An elderly Velsharan stepped forward from among the advisors, their deep purple markings indicating high noble rank and probable centuries of service. "Perhaps the human requires explanation of our customs regarding the selection." "Explain," the Queen commanded. The advisor turned to address James directly, speaking with the careful precision of someone who'd given this explanation before and wanted to make sure every word was understood. In Velsharan tradition, the heir to the throne must choose their mate through the selection, a sacred ritual that has guided our royal lineages for over 2,000 years. The heir observes potential candidates in natural circumstances, evaluating their character, honor, and compatibility. This observation can take months or even years. The candidates are never informed they are being evaluated, as this ensures their behavior remains genuine rather than performative. James felt his stomach drop as the full implication sank in. "You're saying the princess has been secretly watching me. For how long?" 6 months, Princess Kaelsindra said, and there was no apology in her tone, just statement of fact. "I observed your interactions with officials of various ranks, your handling of disputes both minor and significant, your treatment of those beneath your station in circumstances where you had no political incentive to be kind. I read your diplomatic reports, studied your negotiation techniques, and on 3 occasions, met with you directly under assumed identities to assess your character personally." "The library researcher," James said, numbness creeping into his voice. "The supply coordinator," she confirmed. "The guard at the tavern. All me. All tests of your character in different circumstances with different power dynamics to see if your behavior remained consistent." Princess Kaelsindra's markings flickered, showing the first sign of uncertainty since she'd revealed herself. "And it did. You treated everyone with the same basic respect regardless of their apparent rank. You listened before speaking. You admitted ignorance rather than faking expertise. You defended those who needed defending even when it would have been politically easier to stay silent. That's just," James struggled to find words, "that's just being a decent person. That's basic human behavior. It's rare among diplomats of any species," the Queen interjected, her tone dry. "And among potential royal consorts it is virtually unheard of. My daughter has had 17 formal suitors from noble families across the empire over the past decade, all presenting themselves as perfect matches. All of them performed elegance and propriety. All of them calculated every interaction for maximum political advantage." She looked at her daughter with clear affection. "Kaelsindra declined them all. You are the first she has chosen." James looked around the throne room, at the assembled nobles and advisors and guards, all watching him with expressions ranging from curiosity to disapproval to fascination. He looked at the Queen, imposing and absolute on her throne. He looked at Princess Kaelsindra, this woman who'd apparently spent half a year evaluating him without his knowledge and decided he was worthy of what? Marriage, partnership, political alliance. "What happens if I say no?" he asked quietly, and the hall somehow became even more silent, as if the walls themselves were waiting for the answer. The Queen's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The bioluminescent vines dimmed slightly. "You would be within your rights to refuse. We do not force marriage, even in matters of royal succession. Our laws are ancient, but they are not barbaric." She paused, and James knew there was more coming. "However, refusal of a formal selection is considered a grave insult to the royal bloodline. It suggests the candidate finds the chooser unworthy of their commitment. Such insults have historically carried significant consequences. Meaning, James pressed, because he'd learned that euphemisms in alien diplomacy often concealed catastrophically important details. Meaning political relations between Earth and the Velsharan Empire would be severely damaged. An advisor supplied. Meaning your diplomatic career would effectively end, as no Velsharan official would work with someone who'd insulted the royal family. Meaning the cultural exchange programs your people value would likely be suspended pending reconsideration of mutual respect. So, I don't actually have a choice, James said, not quite managing to keep the bitterness out of his voice. I either say yes and bind myself to an empire I barely understand, or I say no and destroy diplomatic relations between our peoples. Those are my options. You have a choice, Princess Kaelsindra said, speaking directly to him for the first time since revealing herself, her voice cutting through the political abstractions. You always have a choice. If you refuse, I will bear the dishonor. I will find ways to minimize the diplomatic damage. You will not be punished beyond the natural consequences of such a decision. She took a breath, her markings flickering with colors his cultural database identified as vulnerability and hope. But I would ask you to consider saying yes. Not because of politics, not because of duty or pressure or diplomatic necessity, but because in the 6 months I spent observing you, in the 3 times I met you directly, I found someone I actually want to know. Someone I want beside me. Not a perfect royal consort who performs propriety, but a genuine partner who treats people with respect and acts with honor even when no one important is watching. James stared at her, at this warrior princess, who could probably kill him in about 40 different ways, but was choosing vulnerability instead, offering honest want instead of political manipulation. His mind was still racing, trying to process everything, trying to find the angle or the trap or the trick, because this couldn't be real, couldn't be happening. I need time, he said finally. I can't make this decision right now, in front of everyone with this much pressure. I need time to think. The Queen studied him for a long moment, and James couldn't tell if she was angry or impressed or calculating his odds of survival if he said the wrong thing. Then she nodded once, sharp and decisive. You have 24 hours to make your decision. Return tomorrow at this same time with your answer. That is all the time I can grant without the delay itself becoming politically significant. James bowed, went through the formal departure sequence, and walked out of the throne hall on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. The guards escorted him back to his quarters in silence. And as the door closed behind him, as he stood alone in the familiar space that suddenly felt completely alien, James Rivera realized his life had just been divided into before and after. Before, when he was just a diplomat doing his job. After, when a princess had chosen him and a queen had asked if he was prepared to be a husband to alien royalty. He had 24 hours to decide. He had absolutely no idea what the right answer was. James sat on his bed for approximately 10 minutes, staring at the wall, his brain refusing to process anything beyond the raw fact that he'd just been proposed to by proxy, by an alien queen in front of her entire court. Then his door chimed, and Ambassador Chen walked in without waiting for permission, which meant the news had traveled through diplomatic channels faster than light-speed communication. So, Chen said, sitting down in James's desk chair without invitation, you're maybe marrying a princess. That's a development. I don't know what I'm doing, James said, his voice coming out flat. This is so far outside normal diplomatic protocols that I don't even know what the protocol is for being outside protocol. Chen pulled out a datapad, started scrolling through what looked like official documents. I've been on comms with Earth for the past hour. There. Interested. Very interested. The Velsharan Empire is one of the most powerful political entities in this sector. An alliance through royal marriage would give us access to trade routes, military protection, and technology exchanges we've been trying to negotiate for decades. If you say yes, you'd be doing more for Earth-Velsharan relations than the past 50 years of diplomacy combined. And if I say no, relations would survive, but it would be tense. The Velsharans value honor and respect above almost everything else. Refusing a royal selection is basically saying the royal family isn't worthy of you, which, Chen looked at him levelly, which would be a lie. I've been reading everything I can access about Princess Kaelsindra in the last hour. She's extraordinary. War hero at 25, published scholar at 30, commands genuine respect from both military and academic circles. Expected to be one of the greatest queens in Velsharan history, and she chose you. She chose a performance, James said. She watched me being decent to people and interpreted it as some kind of exceptional character. That's not who I am, that's just basic human behavior. James. Chen leaned forward. I've worked with diplomats for 30 years. I've seen how people behave when they think no one important is watching. Most of them drop the politeness act immediately. You don't. You treat the janitors in this embassy with the same respect you give me. You learn people's names, you ask about their lives, you actually listen to the answers. That's not common. That's not something you can fake for 6 months while being secretly observed. He paused. The princess didn't choose a performance. She chose you. After Chen left, James did what he always did when faced with impossible decisions. Research. He pulled every file he could access about Princess Kaelsindra, and what he found was simultaneously impressive and terrifying. Military service records showing campaigns where she'd led forces to secure 3 contested border systems, with casualty rates significantly lower than projected, because she apparently valued her soldiers' lives more than most commanders did. Scholarly publications on ancient Velsharan philosophy and ethics that had been cited across multiple academic disciplines. Training records showing proficiency in what his database translated as 17 combat forms, which sounded like a lot. Reports from diplomatic functions describing her as insightful but reserved, and politically shrewd without being manipulative. And underneath all the official records, there were unofficial ones. Soldiers who described her as someone who actually cared about the people under her command. Scholars who praised her intellectual rigor and willingness to admit when she didn't know something. Palace staff who mentioned she was polite to everyone regardless of rank, which apparently was unusual enough to be noteworthy. She sounded, James realized with growing confusion, like someone he'd actually want to meet. Someone he'd respect, maybe even like, if circumstances were different and the fate of diplomatic relations wasn't hanging on his answer. He pulled up the recordings of their 3 meetings. Apparently embassy security captured everything, and Chen had given him access. Watching himself talk to the library researcher, not knowing she was royalty, was surreal. He'd been relaxed, asking stupid questions about mourning customs because he genuinely wanted to understand. She'd been patient, explaining complex cultural concepts without making him feel dumb for not knowing. They'd laughed about something, the translation software misrendering a formal phrase as weeping vegetables instead of respectful remembrance. The supply coordinator meeting was similar. He'd been frustrated about the diplomatic incident, worried he'd caused offense, and the princess had walked him through exactly why it was a problem and how to fix it, treating it as a learning opportunity rather than a condemnation. He'd thanked her, meant it genuinely, and she'd looked at him with an expression he hadn't been able to read then but could read now. Surprised pleasure at being treated like a person rather than a political position. The tavern meeting was the most casual. He'd been off duty, just wanting a drink and some time away from embassy politics. The guard, princess, had been sitting alone, and they'd ended up talking about nothing important. Earth sports versus Velsharan combat games, terrible food from their respective worlds, the absurdity of bureaucracy regardless of species. When the drunk noble had started insulting the guard, James had stood up without thinking, made that comment about people who actually fight being too busy to boast about it, and the princess had laughed, bright and genuine. Watching these interactions, James realized she hadn't been performing either. She'd been genuinely engaged, interested in his perspective, willing to be vulnerable in a way that royalty probably rarely was. They'd connected in all three encounters as people, not as diplomat and princess, not as human and Velsharin, just as two individuals who found each other interesting. His door chimed again. This time he actually checked before opening it, half expecting another official with more information he didn't want. Instead, he found Princess Cassandra herself standing in the corridor, alone, wearing simple civilian clothes rather than the formal armor she'd worn in the throne room. Her silver markings were dim, which his cultural database said indicated either fatigue or deliberate emotional suppression. "May I come in?" she asked, and her voice was quiet, nothing like the formal tones she'd used in front of the court. Not as princess to diplomat, just as two people who need to actually talk. James stepped aside, let her enter. She looked around his modest quarters with clear curiosity, taking in the books about Velsharin culture, the photos from Earth showing his family, the half-finished reports on his desk about trade negotiations that now seemed completely irrelevant. "I owe you an apology," she said without preamble, turning to face him. "The selection process, springing it on you publicly, putting you in a position where refusal means political consequences, forcing you to make this decision under pressure. It wasn't fair to you. I argued for a different approach, wanted to tell you privately first, but my mother insisted on traditional protocols. She believes public declaration binds us to honor, prevents political maneuvering." Cassandra's markings flickered with frustrated orange. "I should have found a way to warn you regardless." "Why me?" James asked, the question that had been burning in his mind since the throne room. "You could have anyone. Noble warriors who understand your culture, brilliant scholars from your own species, people who actually know how to navigate your world without making constant mistakes. Why choose a human diplomat who can barely manage basic court protocols?" Cassandra was quiet for a moment, her markings cycling through colors that suggested internal debate about how much to reveal. Finally, she sat down on his desk chair, her posture less formal, more human somehow. "Can I tell you about the 3 times we met, what I was actually observing?" "Please," James said, sitting on the edge of his bed, leaving space between them that felt simultaneously appropriate and insufficient. "The first time in the library. You were researching mourning customs because you'd accidentally scheduled a trade meeting during the remembrance of fallen swords, a sacred period where we honor soldiers who died in service. Most diplomats would have sent a formal apology note through official channels and moved on. You spent 3 days learning detailed cultural context so you could apologize appropriately, understand why the offense mattered, and ensure you never made that mistake again." Her markings shifted to soft blue. "I was testing whether you actually cared about understanding us or just about avoiding political embarrassment. You cared, deeply, genuinely cared." James remembered that week, the frustration of trying to parse complex mourning rituals through inadequate translation software, feeling like he was failing at the most basic aspect of his job. "The researcher, you were incredibly helpful, made it actually make sense. I was impressed. Most people, when they offend, become defensive. You became curious, wanted to learn why it mattered." She stood, paced to the window overlooking the city. "The second time, as supply coordinator, there was a dispute about embassy food provisions. You'd requested items that violated dietary taboos during the month of cleansing, a religious observance you had no way of knowing about. The noble overseeing supplies wanted to use it as proof of human disrespect, turn it into a formal diplomatic incident. You could have escalated to Ambassador Chen, made it a political issue, protected yourself. Instead, you asked why it was offensive, listened to my explanation, genuinely apologized, and worked with me to find alternatives that respected our customs while meeting your embassy's needs. That's just problem solving," James said. That's what diplomats are supposed to do. It's rare wisdom. Most people, when accused of giving offense, become defensive, insist they meant no harm, make it about their intentions rather than the impact. You made it about understanding and fixing the problem. Cassandra turned to face him, her markings glowing brighter. And the third time, the tavern. I was off duty, trying to have a quiet drink away from palace politics, wearing guard uniform because that's what I am when I'm not being royal. A drunk noble, second cousin of a trade minister, actually, recognized my caste markers and started insulting the Imperial Guard, calling us glorified servants playing at war, suggesting we were beneath real nobility. James winced at the memory. I probably shouldn't have gotten involved. That definitely wasn't diplomatic. You had no political reason to defend me. You didn't know who I was, had no connection to the Guard, and the noble was related to someone important to your trade negotiations. Speaking up should have complicated your job, but you did it anyway. Her markings flashed gold. You told him that in your experience, people who actually fight are usually too busy being good at it to boast about it, and maybe he should try the same approach to whatever his job was. Then you sat back down and went back to your drink like it was nothing. He was being an ass to someone who didn't deserve it, James said simply. Exactly. You defended someone you thought was just a regular guard, based purely on principle, with no expectation of reward or recognition. That's why I chose you, James Rivera. She moved closer, her expression open in a way it hadn't been in the throne room. Not because you're perfect, not because you understand all our customs or fit some ideal image of what a royal consort should be. Because you're genuine. Because you treat everyone as people deserving of respect, regardless of their rank or species or political usefulness. Because, in every interaction I observed, you chose honesty and kindness over expedience and performance. Those seem like low bars, James said quietly. They're the highest bars. Most people fail them constantly, especially in positions of power. Cassandra sat on the bed beside him, close enough that he could see the individual patterns in her bioluminescent markings. Else is telling me what I want to hear, who will care about people as much as policy, who will remind me that power is meant to serve, not just rule. She reached out tentatively, took his hand. Her skin was warmer than he expected, her grip firm. I think you could be that person, if you're willing. James looked at their joined hands, at this warrior princess, who could probably kill him 40 different ways but was choosing vulnerability. I'm scared, he admitted. This is your world, your culture, your role. I'll make mistakes constantly. I'll embarrass you, probably cause diplomatic incidents, have no idea what I'm doing half the time. How is that fair to you? It's fair because I don't want someone who has all the answers. I want someone who's willing to learn, to grow, to fail, and try again. Her markings shifted through colors James was starting to recognize. Blue for affection, gold for hope, purple for determination. And you won't be alone. I'll be there making my own mistakes because I've never done this either. We'll figure it out together. That's what partners do. They talked for hours, until the city lights outside shifted from evening glow to deep night. About expectations and fears. About what marriage between human and Velsharan would actually mean. About the practicalities of merging two lives from completely different cultures. Cassandra explained he'd be expected to learn combat protocols, because royal family members must be able to defend themselves and others. James explained he'd need to maintain connections to Earth, to his family, to his identity as human even while joining Velsharan nobility. She told him about growing up royal, about the weight of expectations, about loving her empire while sometimes feeling crushed by it. He told her about growing up in Mexico City, about his family's confusion when he chose diplomacy as a career, about his mother who still didn't quite understand what he did for a living but was fiercely proud anyway. When she finally stood to leave, dawn light was creeping across the sky outside. At the door she paused. James, whatever you decide tomorrow, I want you to know, the selection was real for me. What I saw in you, what I felt during our conversations, that was genuine. If you say no, I'll be disappointed, but I'll understand. You didn't choose this situation. You shouldn't feel obligated to accept just because of politics. And if I say yes? James asked. Her markings flashed brilliant gold, hope naked on her face. If you say yes, I promise I'll do everything I can to make this partnership real. Not just a political arrangement, but something genuine that we build together. I can't promise it will be easy. I can promise I'll try. After she left, James sat in the growing dawn light and realized he'd already made his decision. Not because of politics or duty or the weight of diplomatic relations. Because the woman who just spent hours talking to him, being vulnerable and honest and genuinely interested in who he was, that woman was someone worth saying yes to. That woman was someone he wanted to know better, wanted to build something with, despite all the complications and impossibilities. He pulled up his communicator, sent a message to Ambassador Chen. I've made my decision. I'm saying yes. The response came almost immediately. You sure about this? James looked out at the alien city waking to morning light. Thought about Princess Caelcendra's hope-filled expression. Thought about building a bridge between worlds through honest partnership. No, but I'm doing it anyway. Good man. Earth supports your decision. Try not to cause too many diplomatic incidents. No promises, James wrote back, and allowed himself a smile. 24 hours had seemed like forever when the Queen first gave him the deadline. Now it felt like no time at all before he'd be standing in the throne room again, giving his answer, changing his life irrevocably. But watching the sun rise over Velshara Prime, thinking about the princess's words and her genuine want for partnership, James felt something he hadn't expected. He felt ready. James stood before the throne for the second time in 2 days, but everything felt different now. He'd spent the morning in careful preparation, wearing his formal diplomatic attire, reviewing every cultural protocol he could think of, rehearsing what he'd say and how he'd say it. Ambassador Chen had wished him luck. His parents, contacted via long-range communications, had expressed confusion and pride in equal measure. His mother had cried and told him to send pictures. His father had asked if he was sure, really sure, absolutely certain, and when James had said yes, had simply said, then make us proud. The throne room was less crowded today, which somehow made it more intimidating. Just the Queen, her closest advisors, and Princess Caelcendra standing to her mother's right, wearing formal armor that caught the light in ways that made her look like something from ancient legends. Her expression was carefully neutral, but her markings were cycling through nervous purples and hopeful golds fast enough that James wondered if anyone else could see she was terrified. He could relate. James Rivera of Earth, Queen Salthara began, and James noticed her tone was slightly less formal than yesterday, almost conversational if you ignored the massive throne and assembled court. You have had time to consider. What is your answer? James took a breath, looked at the Queen, then deliberately shifted his gaze to Caelcendra. This was the part he'd rehearsed, the words he'd chosen carefully. Your Majesty, before I answer, I need to say something that might be considered inappropriate by Velsharan customs. But I'm going to say it anyway, because I think honesty matters more than protocol right now. One of the advisors made a strangled sound. The Queen's expression didn't change. Speak. I spent the last 24 hours terrified. Not because your daughter isn't extraordinary, she clearly is. Not because this alliance wouldn't be beneficial, it obviously would be. I was terrified because I kept thinking about all the ways I could fail at this. All the customs I don't know, all the expectations I can't possibly meet. I'm a decent diplomat, but I'm not royalty. I'm not a warrior. I'm not a scholar of ancient texts. I'm just someone who tries to treat people well and do his job competently. The Queen listened without interruption, her golden markings steady and bright. But then I talked to your daughter, really talked to her, as people rather than as princess and diplomat, and I realized something important. James paused, making sure he had everyone's attention. She's not asking me to be perfect. She's asking me to be genuine, to be a partner, not a performer. And that, he searched for the right words. That's something I think I can actually do. If she's willing to be patient while I learn, if she's willing to teach me what I need to know, if she's willing to build something together rather than expecting me to already have all the answers. He turned fully toward Cassandra now, speaking directly to her rather than to the court. So my answer is yes. I'm prepared to be your husband, not because of politics or duty or diplomatic pressure. Because I spent yesterday reading about you and last night talking to you, and I genuinely want to know who you are beyond the titles and accomplishments. I want to be your partner, if you'll have me, even though I'll probably make countless mistakes along the way. The throne room was absolutely silent. Then Princess Cassandra's markings flashed brilliant gold, brighter than James had ever seen them, and she was moving before her mother could stop her, crossing the formal distance between them, pulling him into an embrace that was definitely not proper court protocol, but that James didn't care about at all because she was warm and solid and real against him, and she was laughing softly against his shoulder. Yes, she whispered, quiet enough that only he could hear. Yes, I'll have you, mistakes and honesty and all of it. The queen cleared her throat, and they broke apart, both suddenly remembering they were in front of the throne with advisors watching. James felt his face heat, which his cultural database unhelpfully noted wasn't visible the way Velsharan emotional displays were, but was probably obvious anyway. When he looked at Queen Salthara, he expected disapproval. Instead, he saw something that might actually have been satisfaction in her expression. "Very well," the queen said, standing from her throne in a way that made everyone else in the room straighten reflexively. "Let it be recorded that James Rivera of Earth has accepted the selection, and will be bound to Princess Cassandra Salmorthani according to ancient custom and modern law. The formal bonding ceremony will be held in 3 weeks. That provides time for essential protocol training, allows Earth to send appropriate diplomatic representation, and gives the Empire time to prepare proper celebration." One of the advisors, an elderly Velsharan with marks so deep purple they were almost black, stepped forward. "Your Majesty, 3 weeks is highly irregular. Traditional bonding ceremonies require months of preparation, careful coordination of. My daughter has already spent 6 months evaluating her choice through the selection." The queen interrupted, her tone suggesting the discussion was over. "The human has made his decision with admirable speed and honesty. 3 weeks is sufficient time for what matters." She looked at James with that unsettling intensity. "Besides, I am curious to see how quickly a human can adapt to Velsharan customs. It should prove educational for all involved." The next 3 weeks became a blur of intensity that made James's previous diplomatic training look like casual vacation. He was moved from his modest embassy quarters to palace guest rooms that were 5 times larger and decorated with art that was probably worth more than his family's house back on Earth. He was assigned a personal attendant, a young Velsharan named Sevrath, who treated him with polite professionalism tinged with clear curiosity about the human who was marrying into royalty. The cultural education was relentless. He had tutors for Velsharan history, philosophy, legal traditions, religious customs, and about 17 other subjects he needed to at least be familiar with. He learned about the caste system, not quite as rigid as human briefings had suggested, more about lineage acknowledgement than strict hierarchy. He learned about the various noble houses, their allegiances and rivalries, which ones would support his inclusion in the royal family, and which ones would view him as an outsider regardless of the queen's decree. But the hardest part was combat training. Royal family members, he learned, were expected to be able to defend themselves and others. It was a tradition dating back to the Unification Wars, when queens and princes fought alongside their soldiers. Modern royalty didn't usually see combat, but they trained for it anyway, maintaining the skills and the symbolism. His combat instructor was a grizzled guard veteran named Talmora who had approximately zero patience for incompetence and treated him exactly the same as she would any other recruit, which James appreciated intellectually, even while his body screamed protest at every new bruise. "Again," Talmora said, watching him attempt a basic defensive stance for what felt like the 100th time. "Your balance is wrong. You're thinking like a human, distributing weight evenly. Velshire combat is about controlled imbalance, being ready to move in any direction." Again. James tried again, his muscles aching from 2 hours of training. Failed again. "You're overthinking," a voice said from the training room entrance, and James turned to see Princess Cassandra watching, her own training armor dusty from what was probably her own session. She walked over, gestured for Talmora to step back, and stood directly in front of James. "May I?" At his nod, she adjusted his stance with her hands, shifting his weight, correcting the angle of his spine. "Human body mechanics are different from ours. Talmora is teaching you the traditional way, which is correct for Velshirans, but you need to adapt it to your structure. Like this." She demonstrated a modified version of the stance that felt more natural to his human frame. "See, same principle, different execution." James tried it, felt the difference immediately. Still difficult but possible rather than fighting against his own physiology. Talmora watched critically, then nodded. "Better. Continue practicing that variation. Princess, your insight is appreciated." After the instructor left, Cassandra stayed, helping James work through the modifications he'd need to make Velshiran combat techniques compatible with human biomechanics. They trained together, and James slowly began to understand that she wasn't just teaching him to fight, she was teaching him how to adapt, how to take Velshiran traditions and make them work for who he was rather than trying to become someone else. "You're doing well," she told him after a session where he'd managed to successfully defend against maybe 5 attacks out of 50. "Better than I expected, honestly." "I'm getting destroyed," James corrected, accepting the water she offered. "You're learning, there's a difference, and you haven't given up, which matters more than natural talent." Her markings shifted to warm blue. "I don't need you to be the best fighter in the Empire. I need you to be someone who won't freeze when danger comes, who will act even imperfectly rather than doing nothing. You're already demonstrating that." They spent as much time together as Cassandra's duties allowed. She showed him the Imperial Library where they'd first met, this time revealing the restricted sections that contained texts dating back thousands of years. They shared meals in private dining rooms where she taught him about Velshiran cuisine, and he introduced her to Earth foods that the palace synthesizers could approximate. They took walks through the palace gardens, talking about everything and nothing, their childhoods, their hopes, their fears about what came next. "Tell me about Earth," she said one evening, as they watched the sunset from a garden terrace. "Not the official briefing version. Tell me what it's actually like." So James told her about Mexico City, about the noise and chaos and millions of people living on top of each other, about street food and traffic and his family's tiny apartment, about his mother who worked 3 jobs to support them, about his father who taught him that respect costs nothing but means everything, about his younger sister who wanted to be a pilot and was probably going to succeed through sheer determination. "They sound remarkable," Cassandra said. "They're regular people, good people but regular. Regular people who raised a son who treats everyone with respect regardless of rank, who runs toward problems instead of away from them, who admits fear but acts anyway." Her markings glowed soft gold. "That's not regular, that's exceptional, regardless of what your culture tells you." "What about you?" James asked. "Tell me about growing up royal. What was that like?" Cassandra was quiet for a moment, her expression distant. "Lonely, sometimes. Everyone treats you as a symbol rather than a person. Every friendship is potentially political. Every conversation might have hidden motives. I had teachers, trainers, advisors, all dedicated to making me into the leader the Empire would need. But few people who just talked to me, saw me as Kale rather than Princess. Is that why you did the selection the way you did? Meeting me in disguise? Partly, but also because I needed to know who you really were. Not the diplomatic performance, not the careful political maneuvering. Just you, being yourself when you thought no one important was watching. She looked at him directly, her green eyes intense. And I found someone worth knowing, worth choosing, even if it meant revealing everything and hoping you'd say yes. James reached for her hand, that gesture becoming natural between them. I'm glad I said yes, terrified but glad. Good, because there's no backing out now. The invitations have been sent, the ceremony is planned, and my mother would be extremely displeased. She squeezed his hand. Also, I'd be disappointed. Just so you know. The 3 weeks passed faster than James expected. Earth sent a delegation including Ambassador Chen, and to James's surprise and delight, his parents and sister. They arrived 5 days before the ceremony, and watching his mother meet Queen Salthara was one of the most entertaining diplomatic encounters James had ever witnessed. His mother, all of 5'2" and perpetually worried, had looked up at the imposing alien queen and said in Spanish, "You take care of my son, or I don't care how many galaxies you rule, I'll find a way to make you regret it." The translator had rendered this as something more diplomatic, but Queen Salthara had looked at James's mother with what might have been respect and responded, "I appreciate a parent who values their children above politics. Your son will be protected and valued, you have my word." His father had been quieter but had pulled James aside later and said, "She's good for you, the princess. I can see it in how you look at her. Like you're surprised and grateful all at once. That's how I looked at your mother when we started. Hold on to that feeling." The bonding ceremony was held in the same throne hall where James had first been asked the impossible question, but transformed into something beautiful. Bioluminescent flowers, somehow imported from Kalesandra's family estate, covered the walls, their light pulsing in soft rhythms. Musicians played instruments that resonated at frequencies James could feel in his chest. The assembled guests were a mix of Velsharan nobility and human diplomats, two cultures watching this unprecedented union. James wore ceremonial armor that had been modified for his human frame, decorated with both Velsharan royal insignia and Earth symbols that his mother had sent. The Mexican flag, the United Earth emblem, small personal touches that reminded him of home. Kalesandra's wore traditional bonding robes in silver and blue, her markings glowing so bright he could see them from across the hall, cycling through colors that suggested joy and nervousness and determination. The ceremony itself was a blend of Velsharan ritual and concessions to human custom. They exchanged vows, his in carefully practiced High Velsharan, hers in surprisingly good English she'd apparently been learning for weeks. They participated in ritual combat demonstrations, a tradition where bonded pairs prove they can defend each other. James got through it without embarrassing himself, barely, executing the modified techniques Kalesandra had taught him. The final ritual involved the lighting of joined paths, where both participants held flame torches and lit a central brazier together, symbolizing their merged futures. As their flames met, the fire erupted upward in a column of light that painted the entire hall in warm colors. In flame witnessed, in honor bound, in partnership chosen, the priest intoned in ancient Velsharan that James's translator rendered as something profound about unity and strength. Let all who witness acknowledge. James Rivera of Earth and Princess Kalesandra Salmorthani are bonded by ancient law and modern choice, partners in truth, equals in purpose. The hall erupted in applause, Velsharans and humans alike, celebrating this impossible alliance. Kalesandra pulled him into a kiss that was definitely more passionate than formal protocol suggested, but that James absolutely didn't care about because she was his wife now, this remarkable woman who'd chosen him for reasons he was still figuring out. When they broke apart, she whispered against his ear, "Hello, husband." "Hello, wife," he whispered back, and her markings flashed so bright gold that several guests gasped. The reception that followed was massive, with dignitaries from across the empire and earth mixing in ways that would have been unthinkable months ago. James navigated it with Cassandra at his side, and together they managed the conversations, the political implications, the endless well-wishes. His mother somehow ended up talking to Queen Salthara again, and James watched in fascination as two women from completely different worlds bonded over shared stories of their children being impossible but wonderful. Late that night, after the formal events had ended and they'd retreated to their new shared quarters, a suite that was larger than his entire family's apartment on Earth, James and Cassandra stood on their private balcony, looking out at the city. "So," James said, pulling her close, "we did it, we're actually married." "We're actually married," Cassandra confirmed, leaning against him in a way that was becoming familiar and comforting. "You're now formally consort to the heir of the Velsharan throne. How does it feel?" "Terrifying, exciting, completely surreal, but also," he paused, searching for the right words, "right somehow. Like this is where I'm supposed to be, even though I never imagined anything like it." "I knew from the first week of observing you that you were different," Cassandra said quietly, "but I was afraid. Afraid I was seeing what I wanted to see, afraid you'd refuse, afraid I'd chosen based on hope rather than reality. And now I'm certain I chose correctly. You're exactly who I thought you were, honest and brave and kind. Stubborn too, and you ask too many questions, and you'll definitely cause diplomatic incidents by being truthful when politics." He'd been asked if he was prepared to be her husband. He hadn't been, not really. But he'd been willing to try, willing to learn, willing to build something real from an arrangement that could have been purely political. And somehow, impossibly, they'd found love in the process. The Queen had asked a question that changed his life. Princess Cassandra had chosen him for reasons he was still discovering. And James Rivera had said yes, and found a destiny that was terrifying and wonderful and completely his. Together, they would shape what came next. Partners in truth, bound by choice, building bridges between worlds one honest moment at a time. Morning came too early, which James was learning was a universal constant regardless of species or planet. He woke to find Cassandra already up, sitting at the desk in their quarters reviewing what looked like military reports, her markings cycling through the focused blues and purples that indicated she was working. She wore simple training clothes, her hair tied back practically, and looked every inch the warrior-scholar princess she was. "How long have you been awake?" James asked, his voice rough from sleep. She glanced over, her expression softening immediately, markings shifting to warm gold. "About 2 hours. I'm used to early schedules from military service. Old habits." She stood, crossed to sit on the edge of the bed beside him. "But you should sleep more. Yesterday was exhausting for everyone. Yesterday I got married to an alien princess in a ceremony attended by half the diplomatic corps of known space. I think exhausting might be an understatement." James sat up, pulled her closer. "How are you feeling about all this?" "Honestly, relieved." Cassandra leaned against him, comfortable in a way that suggested she was done performing for anyone. "I spent months worrying you'd refuse, that I'd misread you entirely, that the selection would fail and I'd have to start over with someone else. Having you actually here, actually mine, it feels like I can finally breathe properly. I'm glad one of us feels settled. I still keep waiting for someone to realize this is a terrible idea and call it off." James kissed the top of her head, enjoying the fact that he could do that now. That intimacy was allowed rather than politically complicated. "What happens now, after the ceremony, after everyone goes home? Now we figure out what being partners actually means in practice." Cassandra pulled up a holographic display from her wrist device, showing a schedule that made James's eyes hurt. "I have military briefings this afternoon, a scholarly conference next week that I'm presenting at, and approximately 40 different diplomatic functions over the next month. You'll be expected to attend most of them, at least until the novelty of human consort wears off enough that your absence isn't politically significant. So basically, I'm going to be displayed like an interesting artifact while important people evaluate whether I'm adequate for you, James said. Essentially, yes. I'm sorry about that. Her markings flickered apologetic purple. Court politics are exhausting even for people who grow up in them. For you, it's going to be like learning to swim by being thrown into the deep ocean. I should probably stop using Earth metaphors. You don't have oceans on Velshara Prime. We have historical oceans, just not currently liquid ones. Climate shift about 6,000 years ago turned them into the mineral flats you see now. She dismissed the schedule display. But your point stands. This is going to be difficult. You'll make mistakes, people will judge you, some will actively work to undermine you because they see you as a political liability or because they wanted me to choose someone from a noble Velsharan house. That's encouraging, James said dryly. I'm not trying to discourage you. I'm trying to be honest about what we're facing. Kalesindra turned to look at him directly. But you won't be alone. I'll be there, helping you navigate the politics, teaching you what you need to know. And you have something most court politicians lack. What's that? Genuine decency. You treat people well because that's who you are, not because it's politically advantageous. That's going to win you allies they can't buy or manipulate. Her markings glowed confident gold. Plus, my mother approves of you. That counts for more than you might think. The next few weeks proved Kalesindra's predictions accurate in uncomfortable ways. James attended diplomatic functions where he was simultaneously the center of attention and treated like he wasn't quite qualified to have opinions. Noble houses evaluated him with expressions ranging from curious to disdainful. Military officials seemed unsure whether to treat him as royal family or as the civilian he was. Academic circles were more welcoming. Apparently his background in diplomacy and his obvious efforts to learn about Velsharan culture earned him some credibility in scholarly communities. The worst was a formal dinner with several noble houses who'd had daughters or sons they'd hoped Kalesindra would choose. The dinner was technically welcoming, officially congratulatory, and practically an extended exercise in passive-aggressive evaluation of everything James did wrong. He used the wrong utensil for one course. His formal address to an elder noble was slightly too casual. His attempt at a traditional Velsharan greeting gesture got the hand positioning wrong by about 3 degrees. He endured it with as much grace as he could manage, answering questions honestly even when honesty revealed his ignorance, making self-deprecating jokes that occasionally landed and occasionally made the nobles exchange looks that suggested they were reassessing whether humans understood humor at all. Kalesindra sat beside him through it all, her markings betraying irritation whenever someone was particularly condescending, but her expression remaining diplomatically neutral. When one noble, a pompous elder with marks so dark purple they were almost black, asked James directly how he planned to handle military traditions he couldn't possibly understand, she'd interrupted smoothly. James will handle them the same way I handle Earth diplomatic protocols I'm still learning, with honest effort, willingness to ask questions, and understanding that competence comes through practice rather than immediate perfection. Her tone was light, but her markings flashed warning orange. Any other approach would be performative arrogance, which serves no one. The table had gone quiet. The noble had inclined his head in acknowledgement, properly rebuked, and James had felt profound gratitude for having a partner who'd defend him even while maintaining diplomatic propriety. Later in their quarters, he'd asked her about it. You didn't have to do that. I can handle some condescending nobles. You could handle it, but you shouldn't have to endure it alone. Kalesindra had pulled him close, her markings soft blue. We're partners. That means when someone attacks you, they're attacking us. I won't tolerate it from nobles who think bloodline makes them superior to genuine character. But not all interactions were difficult. James discovered he had unexpected allies in surprising places. The Imperial Guard, who he'd expected to be suspicious of an outsider, largely accepted him after word spread about his combat training. Not that he was particularly skilled, but that he was genuinely trying despite having no natural talent or cultural background. Talmora, his instructor, apparently told people he was terrible but determined, which in Guard culture was apparently a significant compliment. The palace staff were even more welcoming. He'd made a habit of learning their names, asking about their lives, treating them with the same respect he gave nobles. It was just how he'd been raised, but on Velshara Prime, where hierarchy was more pronounced, it apparently made an impression. The head steward, an elderly Velsharan named Morsev who'd served the royal family for decades, told him quietly one day that he was the first royal consort in living memory who remembered that people who serve are still people. His relationship with Queen Salthara evolved from formal respect to something almost comfortable. She summoned him for private meetings occasionally, ostensibly to discuss his progress adapting to court life, but really to evaluate him in ways that were less obvious than direct questions. They'd talk about Earth, about his family, about his observations of Velsharan culture. She'd ask his opinion on political situations, not because she needed his input, but because she was testing whether he thought critically or just agreed with authority. "You're not what I expected when Kaelsandra first mentioned the selection," the Queen told him during one of these meetings, about 2 months into his marriage. "I anticipated someone more diplomatic, more careful with their words." "I'm plenty careful," James protested. "I think about what I say. You think about whether you're being truthful, not about whether you're being politically optimal. There's a difference." The Queen sipped her tea, an earth blend James had introduced her to that she'd become fond of. "It's refreshing, also occasionally problematic, but mostly refreshing." "Is that approval?" James asked carefully. "It's acknowledgement that my daughter chose well. You're honest, brave, and genuinely care about people beyond their political utility. Those qualities are rare in any culture, especially in positions of power." Her golden markings glowed steady and bright. "You'll make mistakes. You'll cause diplomatic incidents. You'll occasionally say things that make my advisors despair. But you'll also remind us why we serve our people rather than ruling them, and that's worth considerable political inconvenience." The most profound change was in his relationship with Kaelsandra herself. The ceremonial bonding had been formal and public, but the actual marriage, the daily practice of being partners, was something they had to build together. They learned each other's rhythms, their habits, their triggers and comforts. He discovered she was almost compulsively organized about military matters but chaotic about personal space, leaving armor pieces scattered across their quarters. She discovered he needed quiet time to process difficult days, that he thought better when walking, that he showed affection through small acts of service rather than grand gestures. They argued occasionally, about cultural differences, about priorities, about how to handle political situations. But they'd made a rule early on: absolute honesty between them, even when honesty was uncomfortable. So when James was frustrated with court politics, he told her. When Kaelsandra was worried he wasn't adapting quickly enough, she said so. And they worked through it together, finding compromises that honored both their needs. 3 months into their marriage, James was reviewing reports in their quarters when Kaelsandra returned from a military briefing looking exhausted. Her markings were dim, which meant she was either tired or actively suppressing emotions, and her movements were tight with tension. "Bad meeting?" he asked, setting aside his work. "Frustrating meeting. Border situation with the Crithian coalition is escalating again. Military command wants aggressive posturing, diplomatic corps wants continued negotiations. My mother wants both simultaneously somehow." She dropped into a chair with less grace than usual. "And everyone wants my input as heir, but they all want me to support their particular position, which means whatever I say will disappoint half the room. James moved behind her chair, started massaging her shoulders the way he'd learned she found relaxing. What do you actually think should happen? Honestly, I think the Krithians are testing our resolve, and we need to demonstrate strength while leaving diplomatic channels open. Show we're willing to defend our borders but prefer peaceful resolution. Her markings shifted slightly toward gold as the tension eased from her shoulders. But that's a complicated position to maintain, and it requires coordination between military and diplomatic branches who currently hate each other. So make them coordinate. You're the heir. They have to listen to you eventually. It's not that simple. I can't just issue orders when my mother is still queen. I can suggest, recommend, influence, but direct command isn't mine yet. She leaned back into his hands. Sometimes I wish I could just solve problems like you do, see what needs doing and do it, politics be damned. That approach got me proposed to by royalty, so maybe it works, James said, and was rewarded with her laugh bright and genuine, her markings flashing gold. Fair point. Your reckless honesty has worked out remarkably well so far. She pulled him around to sit on the arm of her chair, looked up at him with an expression that was tender and tired and trusting. Thank you. For what? For being you, for being here, for not turning into someone different now that you're officially consort. Her markings glowed soft blue. I was afraid at first that court politics would change you, make you performative like everyone else, but you're still just James. Honest and kind and occasionally frustratingly direct. It's grounding. I don't know how to be anyone else, James admitted. This is the only personality I've got. For better or worse, you're stuck with it. Better, definitely better. She stood, pulled him to his feet, wrapped her arms around him in an embrace that was about comfort rather than passion. I love you. Did I mention that today? You did this morning, but I'll never complain about hearing it again. He held her close, feeling the warmth of her against him, the steady rhythm of her breathing. I love you too. Even when you leave armor pieces all over the bedroom, and I trip over them in the dark. That happened once. 3 times I'm counting. They stood together in comfortable silence. 2 people from different worlds who'd built something real from an arrangement that could have been purely political. Outside their windows, the city lights glowed as Velshara Prime's twin moons rose, painting everything in silver and shadows. 5 months into their marriage, James received a communication from Earth that changed things in unexpected ways. His mother was sick, not life-threatening, but serious enough to require treatment, and his father was asking if James could come home for a visit. Just a few weeks, to see family, to be there during a difficult time. He brought it to Caelsandra immediately, unsure how to navigate leaving Velshara Prime when he was still so new to court life. She'd read the message, then looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Of course you're going, she said. Your family needs you, that's not even a question. But court obligations, diplomatic functions, your mother. My mother will understand. Family duty is something Velsharans take seriously. She'd be disappointed if you didn't go. Caelsandra pulled up a scheduling display, started making notes. I'll clear your calendar for 3 weeks. That should give you time with your family without leaving too many political gaps. Come with me, James said suddenly, the idea forming as he spoke. Come to Earth. Meet my family properly, see where I'm from. We can combine it, I'll be there for my mother, and you can actually experience human culture rather than just reading about it. Caelsandra stared at him. That would be unprecedented. The Velsharan heir visiting Earth for personal rather than diplomatic reasons. It would require security coordination, political approval, probably a dozen briefings. So let's do all that. If I'm going to be part of your world, you should see mine. James reached for her hand. Besides, my mother threatened your mother at our wedding. They should probably get to know each other better. The trip to Earth required 2 weeks of preparation, endless security protocols, and approximately 40 diplomatic briefings about what Caelsandra could and couldn't say about Velsharan military capabilities. But finally, they were on a transport heading toward Earth, accompanied by a small security detail and enough official documentation to start an archive. Landing in Mexico City was surreal. James hadn't been home in over a year, and seeing Earth through Caelcendra's eyes made him notice things he'd taken for granted. The noise, the chaos, the sheer number of humans packed into urban density that would have violated every Velsharan city planning regulation. The smells of street food and vehicle exhaust, and millions of people living on top of each other. The color and movement and messy, vital energy of humanity being itself. His family's apartment was small and cramped by Velsharan standards, but his mother had cleaned it until it shone and prepared enough food to feed approximately 40 people despite only 6 being present. His father embraced him with the kind of strength that suggested he'd been more worried than he'd let on. His sister immediately started interrogating Caelcendra about Velsharan technology, military tactics, and whether aliens really thought humans were as chaotic as the media suggested. Yes, Caelcendra answered honestly, her markings flickering with amused gold. But chaotic in ways that are often effective. You're unpredictable, which makes you either terrible or excellent at various tasks, depending on whether unpredictability is an advantage. I knew it, his sister said triumphantly. Humans are strategic chaos. I'm putting that on my academy application. His mother was recovering well, the medical treatment working, and she insisted on cooking for everyone despite James and his father both trying to take over. You brought home a princess, she said firmly in Spanish. I'm making her proper food, not whatever synthetic things they serve in palaces. The food was incredible, familiar flavors that James hadn't realized he'd missed so desperately. His mother's cooking that tasted like home and childhood and belonging. Caelcendra tried everything, her cultural database translating ingredient information, her markings cycling through colors that indicated she was genuinely enjoying the experience. This is remarkable, she told his mother through the translator. The complexity of flavors, the preparation techniques, this is art, not just nutrition. His mother beamed, immediately offered to teach her recipes. And just like that, they were bonding over cooking techniques and family stories, while James and his father exchanged looks of amused resignation. They stayed 3 weeks. James visited hospitals with his mother, caught up with old friends who were fascinated and bewildered by his new life in equal measure. Caelcendra experienced Earth properly, visiting historical sites, attending a football match that confused her completely, eating street food that made her security detail nervous, and generally being fascinated by human chaos. On their last night, sitting on the tiny balcony of his family's apartment with the city spread below them in lights and noise, Caelcendra leaned against him and said quietly, I understand now. Understand what? Why you are the way you are. Your family, your city, your culture. It's all genuine connection, messy and loud and real. No performance, no political calculation, just people caring about each other openly. Her markings glowed soft blue. It's beautiful, different from Velsharan culture but beautiful. You see why I struggle with court politics sometimes, James said. Where I'm from, pretending to feel things you don't feel is lying, and lying is bad. Your culture has about 17 different acceptable levels of diplomatic deception, and I can't keep track of which context requires which approach. I know, and I'm starting to think that's not a weakness. Caelcendra kissed him softly. Your honesty makes you different. It makes you effective in ways court politicians can't be. Don't change that, even if it makes things harder sometimes. Flying back to Velshara Prime, James felt something shift in how he understood their partnership. He'd seen his culture through her eyes, she'd experienced his world directly, and now they had shared context that went beyond diplomatic briefings. They understood each other better, the foundations of their different worldviews, the assumptions and values that shaped how they each approached problems. 6 months into their marriage, Queen Salthara summoned them both for what she called a conversation about the future. They sat in her private study, the informal space where real discussions happened, and the queen regarded them both with an expression that was hard to read. "You've adapted well," she said to James. "Better than I predicted, honestly. You still make mistakes, still occasionally say things that make my advisors wince, but you're learning, growing into the role." She shifted her attention to her daughter. "And you're happier than I've seen you in years. More grounded, more confident in your decisions." "Thank you, Mother," Kalsundra said carefully, clearly waiting for the actual point of this conversation. "I'm stepping down," the Queen said, and the room went absolutely silent. "Not immediately. 2 years from now, when the Succession Council convenes. I'll formally transfer power to you, Kalsundra. It's time you're ready." Kalsundra's marking cycled through about 12 colors in rapid succession: shock, fear, excitement, determination. "Mother, are you certain? I'm 73 years old. I've ruled for 45 years. I've seen wars end and alliances form and our empire grow into something stable and strong. It's time for new leadership, new perspectives." The Queen looked at James. "It's also time for new traditions. Having a human consort as partner to the Queen will send powerful messages about cooperation between species, about valuing character over bloodline." "No pressure," James muttered and was surprised when the Queen laughed. "Immense pressure, actually, but you've demonstrated you can handle it." She stood, which prompted them both to stand as well. 2 years, use them well. Learn what you need to learn, strengthen the partnerships you'll need, prepare for leadership. And James, she looked at him directly, help my daughter remember that power serves people, not itself. You're good at that, keep doing it. After they left, walking through palace corridors back to their quarters, Kalsundra was quiet. James waited, giving her space to process until she finally spoke. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "I've trained for this my entire life, but now that it's actually happening, I feel completely unprepared." "You're the most competent person I've ever met," James said. "You'll be an excellent queen. Will you be ready to be consort to a ruling queen rather than an heir? The expectations will be even more intense, the scrutiny more